Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I am Tamara Ecker, Managing Director of British American Business, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's session, where we will take a look back at year one of the Biden administration. I'm pleased to say we have managed to recruit for you an incredibly impressive roster of speakers to help us unpack some of the policies the administration has executed over the past 12 months and their material impact on US tax and the economy more broadly. Today's annual program is made possible thanks to the partnership and support of BAB member EY. And we are also thrilled to have speakers from BAB members Aberdeen, Bloomberg, and Brunswick, who will be properly introduced in just a moment. In terms of some logistics to get us going, we will begin the session with about a half-hour panel discussion moderated by Peggy Collins, Washington Bureau Chief for Bloomberg News. We will then open up to you, the audience, for live Q&A. Please either use the raise your hand feature or send a note in the chat to myself or Peggy, and we will call on you to ask your question. And we do encourage everyone to please keep your cameras on throughout the session, but please keep your microphones on mute. And I will note that today's session is on the record. Now to take us through the session, I'm delighted to introduce Peggy Collins, Washington Bureau Chief for Bloomberg News. Previous to her current role, Peggy oversaw the newsroom's coverage of the US economy during the pandemic as managing editor. Peggy's tenure at Bloomberg runs over a decade, having started in 2009 as a reporter covering personal finance, wealth management, and family offices. Peggy, thrilled to have you, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Tamara. We have a terrific panel for you today to really talk about what happened in the Biden administration's first year, and importantly, where we go from here. So it's a cold yet sunny day in DC here today. As Tamara said, I'm the Washington Bureau Chief for Bloomberg News. I'm going to introduce the esteemed panelists to you and kick off the discussion in a moment. But just a reminder that we will leave time at the end for Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to be on camera. So let me introduce the three panelists that we have first, and then we'll start our discussion. We have with us Kate Barton, who is the Global Vice Chair of Tax with Ernst & Young, Stephanie Kelly, who's the Deputy Head of Aberdeen Research Institute at Aberdeen, and Doug Sosnick, Senior Advisor at the Brunswick Group in DC. So thanks to all three of you for joining us today and sharing your insights. Kate, I was thinking I would start with you. Can you tell us what are 2 or 3 mega trends that you see happening right now in terms of tax policy and the economy as a result of the Biden administration's first year?
Sure, Peggy, delighted to be here with you all. So I think we're seeing 3 huge mega trends coming out of the world that we're living in right now as we move from pandemic to hopefully endemic at some time in the future. And the first is tax codes around the world are being used to raise taxes. Almost every country in the world is revenue starved. And so they're all looking to, to fix that situation and to get more revenue. So we're going to see rates go up and new taxes get introduced, some to encourage behavior, some to discourage behavior. Second is supply chains. Clearly, the pandemic showed us that a lot of goods and services were not in the right location. So having a single hub strategy is something that many multinationals and countries are really looking at and looking to use their tax code to incent companies to move the supply chain closer to the consumer. And then the third mega trend is really social inequities. I think we saw that almost in every country, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. So tax codes will be used to redistribute that wealth. And so clearly that's on the minds of President Biden, but it's also on the minds of the prime ministers and world leaders across the globe. So all of that is going to intersect for multinationals in the days ahead.
So let's stay with tax policy just for a moment there when you talk about that mega trend, Kate. We did actually see quite an advancement on the global sphere in terms of tax policy in 2021. Where does that stand now? Are we at a stalemate, or how do you see it in terms of pressing forward with a global agreement?
Well, it is really exciting, Peggy, when you think about it in this world of a lot of nationalistic behavior that on the tax side, we were able to get a multilateral agreement, started in the summer with G7, then G20, and then really endorsed by the OECD. They've been working on it for 2 years, and we have what we like to affectionately call BEPS 2.0 that is now in the process of being enacted. So where are we? Where we are right now is the European Union, all the rules came out in December, right before the holidays. So thousands of pages for us tax folks to digest. And the European Union came out with their adoption. So it's open for comments. They hope to get their directive issued in March. And so 27 member states they might be the first to get this done. The US's compliance is hung up in this Build Back Better legislation, which is now sort of bumping along, and we can get into that. But the US right now has made a lot of promises on the global stage, but has some issues getting that, fully compliant, if you will, with where the OECD is.
And certainly with Congress coming back this week here in DC, that's something we're going to be covering in terms of where does the Biden administration go with that BBB Build Back Better plan that is stalled in Congress right now. We'll talk more about that, as you said, Kate, but I want to bring in Doug here. Doug, you also see some big trends or shifts globally in terms of things that will change and have implications for businesses around the world. You were talking about when we were preparing for this panel that you see the shift to a 21st digital economy and world. How do you see that playing out when it comes to policy and politics and how it could affect businesses this year?
Well, hi, thank you for having me. I think it's most important to look at the macro trends right now rather than the micro trends and the election coming up. And my view is we're going through the biggest transition, I think, in the world, but I'll just speak for America. We're going through the biggest transition since the late 1800s, when we moved from an agrarian society to an industrial society. And we've had a combination of a declining middle class for 50 years, the global economy that's changed for jobs in America. And I think that the crises in 2008 really made the divisions between the top and the bottom wider, and I think COVID is as well. At the same time, these economic trends has been a demographic transformation in America, which started with the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act. And within the middle of the 2040s or so, roughly, we'll be a majority minority country in which less than 50% of Americans will be white. So this period of transition, which we're now about 25, 30 years into it, is creating a lot of political instability, greater divisions. 7 out of the last 8 elections, the country's voted for whoever's in power. If we're here 5 years from now, my guess is it's be 10 out of the last elections. It means every 2 years they're going out and voting against whoever they voted for 2 years earlier. And so the simplest way for me to describe the divisions in our country right now is half the country thinks we're changing too fast, and the other half of the country doesn't think we're changing fast enough. And I think that these divisions and the political instability is going to increase significantly in this decade, not get better. And for corporations to manage all this, it's an environment in which people are turned off by politics. Look at the ratings for all the cable shows since the election and the newspapers. So people are done, they're sick of politics. They hate all of them. There is no base in America right now in the political system for corporations. They're a political orphan. They used to be largely associated with the Republican Party. That's no longer the case. And the country is anti-institution. They think essentially our 20th century institutions have been incapable of dealing with these 21st century problems. So as a result, the majority of people in the country, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, thinks institutions are either broken or they're corrupt. And the last thing I'll say is, I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is, I think, a reflection of what's going on in America. He's not the cause of it. Now, he may have taken some things and tried to make it worse, but the fact that the country had so little investment in the people that have been running the country, that they felt like in 2016 and almost in 2020, that they had very little to lose by voting for Trump because of how alienated they feel from the people in politics who've been around for a long time, whether they're a Democrat or Republican.
So Stephanie, Doug is really hitting on this point of political discord in DC. When you're thinking about businesses, how do they gauge what's realistic in terms of what the Biden administration can actually get done this year?
I think this is one of the big kind of differences when you compare the administration so far to the previous administration, as Doug was just talking about. I think in many ways, particularly for international businesses, the image that they get when they see Biden, at when you see Biden at the COP26 and at major multilateral meetings, actively engaging, there's definitely a very clear message from a political perspective that US diplomacy is back, the role of the US isn't in doubt, allies are allies again, all that kind of stuff. But I think the challenge for businesses is actually taking into account not just what Biden is wanting to do, and I think it is a genuine desire to act on climate, it is a genuine desire to engage with the world, but in certain policy areas, he is extremely limited by the domestic politics of the country, and specifically of the fact that currently he has he has a majority of 50 plus the vice president in the Senate, which means he can't lose anyone. And the Build Back Better is a really great example of where you had really positive reaction to President Biden being actively involved in COP26, but many of the climate policies that he requires in order to live up to the promises that the US has made around climate and the energy transition, it requires the support of Congress. And I think that's been the real lesson, and that kind of the bifurcation and the change in the way that these kind of very divisive issues, climate remains a divisive issue even within the Democratic Party. I think that's one of the most interesting challenges for business, is not just what are the Republicans saying versus what are the Democrats saying, but actually what are the Democrats saying to each other and to the market, because that can be a fundamentally different thing, as we have learned through Joe Manchin from West Virginia, basically stopping in its track a bill that would have been to the tune of $1.7 trillion and would have gone very long on issues that are internationally important, like climate change.
And Stephanie, I know you've also been, in addition to climate and the other issues you were just talking about, watching trade. Do you have some thoughts on where we could go in terms of trade this year that is important for businesses to keep in mind? Because it has receded a bit in terms of being in the spotlight.
It's definitely less in the spotlight. We are seeing fewer tweets, which tends to mean you get less of that kind of immediate reaction from businesses and from the market. But I think just because it's not in view doesn't mean that it doesn't continue to be a headwind longer term. If anything, if you look at the Biden administration and the Democratic Party writ large, I would say the one issue that Democrats and Republicans agree on seems to be China, which in and of itself is something of a concern, I think. But on top of that, even within the Democratic Party, actually, some of the issues the Democrats have, including Biden, with engaging particularly in trade with China. China is the key area of kind of stress, I think. But one of the key issues is that it's not just about numbers anymore. It's not just how many soybeans will you buy. And we know that President Trump was very focused on tit for tat. We'll raise tariffs. If you buy more soybeans, we'll consider lowering tariffs, all of that. It was quite mechanical and easier to understand. I think the challenge now is that the Biden administration is saying, they're not outright encouraging trade war. They've actually been somewhat critical of tariffs in some kind of fora, but in other ways, they're saying, well, we're really concerned about issues like transparency, cybersecurity, human rights. These are really difficult topics to talk to the Chinese about, because naturally the Chinese government is has been very kind of defensive and very like, we're not discussing domestic issues. You have no right to have that conversation. That makes it harder to see a long-term positive trajectory for trade. So it leaves me sort of in the middle in a way. It's like, I don't expect loads of crazy tweets to just suddenly come out where trade tariffs have gone up another 5%. That's not what I'm expecting. But do I expect a significant improvement? Probably not, because it's hard to make the justification for improving trade relations between the two largest powers when the Democrats are really concerned about issues that go beyond just the number of soybeans and go to really deep existential issues for the Chinese system that they're not going to engage on with the US.
So Kate, I saw you nodding your head as Stephanie was speaking, and also you mentioned BBB at the top. How are you trying to assess the potential implications on the economy and certainly broader of the Build Back Better plan, even though it's stalled right now on the domestic side?
Well, I think first, companies were grateful just to get certainty at year end. I think 4 years ago, we got massive legislation right in December. That is really hard for companies. They were concerned that they were going to get another holiday gift, if you will, right at the end, and it didn't come through. And So obviously there's some companies that really want it, some that don't, as you can imagine. There's a lot of features in the plan. But really, I guess as we look forward here in 2022, there's a narrow window to get this done. I mean, there is a narrow window, and I think everybody will have a little bit of a different take on what that window is. Does it go to March? I think that's what President Biden has indicated is he'd like to get this resurfaced after he does a few other things that he's focused on right now and bring this back, if you will, in March. Some will say it could go as long as May before it closes down. And the reason is that, as you know, the mid-year elections start and people start to become fairly myopic in terms of getting themselves reelected right about that time frame. And it's very difficult to get something passed. And, again, it's anyone's guess as to what will happen in the mid-year elections. I think Doug's gave some insights on that. But, so the window is narrow. There's a lot there, and it's really anyone's guess, and there's a lot of discussion going on behind the scenes, and you don't think that is absolutely happening to see if they can't garner the 51 votes that they need in the Senate, which has been the problem area.
Yeah, and it's a good point, Kate, because so often we thinking about March or May, and it seems like we have a lot of time, but when you're really in DC and see how much goes into putting the legislation together, getting it to the floor, getting the votes, it moves, time elapses quickly, I guess I should say. You did mention, and Doug, you talked about this a little bit already, but could you talk to us a little bit more about how important you see these midterm elections in November in terms of that disruptive quality, that discord that you're talking about more broadly? How big of a deal is this going to be, this midterm election, in terms of disrupting business and potentially the economy?
Well, I got out of the prediction business after the 2016 presidential elections, but I think it would be shocking if the Democrats don't get really close to being slaughtered in the midterms, with the Republicans taking back at least the House, and I think probably more likely than not the Senate. And that while I will flag one set of events this year, or just to reinforce your point earlier, we call, like in politics, an election cycle. At some point in every cycle, the cake gets baked. It's like in an oven. And normally the cake gets baked around midsummer. And we have much earlier voting now, starting in early September. So we really only have around 4 months, 5 months at most between now and when the people will start settling in. There is one set of political events that can be extremely divisive this year in American politics, which is both the filling of the Supreme Court nomination, the Breyer seat, and also at the end of June, likely a ruling from Roe versus Wade. So that will be disruptive. Now, having said all that, under the assumption that Republicans take back at least one branch of Congress, I think people in the political world in the United States are underestimating how significant that's going to be. And I think you're going to have a completely different world politically the day after the midterms, when you have the Republicans in charge of at least half of Congress. They'll start investigating the Biden administration for 2 years. My guess at some point they'll probably impeach Biden. And the Republican presidential nomination fight for president will start the day after the midterms. So all the political incentives on the Republican side has become even more strident, not less strident. And while up until today, the party of Trump controls the Republican Party at the state and local level and in the House of Representatives. The last outpost of a relative sort of resistance has been in the Republican conference in the United States Senate. There are 5 what I call governing wing members of the Republican Senate who are retiring, and are all going to probably be replaced by Trumpites. So at the end of the election cycle, the party of Trump will have consolidated their power on both sides of Congress. And so the political incentives for the next 2 years are going to be completely geared towards more divisiveness, not working together. The last thing I'll say on all this is, so what will happen in the last 2 years of a Biden administration is they increasingly understand and acknowledge they can't get anything done legislatively. It's all going to be about what they can use to the powers of the executive branch And the one thing that Biden has done in the executive branch, he has almost without exception nominated acolytes of Elizabeth Warren into all the regulatory positions in the federal government that they're going to increasingly use as a weapon to get done through executive powers that cannot get done legislatively.
So just to echo you there, you see the second half of Biden's first term as presidency or only term as presidency as really being stalled or stymied by the fact that Republicans will likely take over on the leadership side, and that he'll have to turn to executive orders in order to get anything done. Whereas this year, he may have a small window left to get some things done through Congress.
Well, every day you're in, I spent 6 years in the Clinton White House. Every day that you get closer to, you get further from the day you took office is the day you have less power. And if you look at Reagan's first term of 4 years or Obama's, I would say 50 to 75% of the importance of an administration, what is remembered, what you get done is in the first year. And every year past that first year, if you look back to history, you see that the leverage of the executive and the power and the ability to get things done and things that are memorable diminish every year. It's really the first year sets the arc. In the first years, we can get one or two big things done, and that defines a presidency.
Stephanie, I know you've been really watching this interplay internationally in terms of how much of Biden's ability to get things done domestically has affected plans or policies or agendas more internationally. You mentioned climate change being one. When you think about the Ukraine and Russia tensions that are happening right now, how do you see that fitting in internationally to what businesses and what the economy is going to experience?
So I think, it's interesting because in some ways the Russia-Ukraine issues, and particularly the role the US is playing, I think very much speak to Biden's kind of key rhetoric and messaging around the role that the US has to play as this kind of stabilizing force within the international order. So I think that's something that business should kind of expect. In terms of how you solve Russia and Ukraine, I think is a really fundamentally very challenging topic, maybe one for an entire webinar, because clearly it's an iterative process as opposed to a kind of zero-sum game. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. But in terms of, if you take what are the key messages you should take from the conflict, from kind of zooming out from a company perspective, I think it is that idea that Biden is seeking to make a few things very clear. One is that America's allies are America's allies. And that seems like a very obvious statement, but there were 4 years in which that was actually not taken for granted in the international sphere. European partners were very uncertain as to the potential role for the United States in that relationship going forward. Even the UK-US relationship, particularly under the previous Prime Minister, Theresa May, it was less clear how strong that and special that relationship will continue to be. It's very clear now that Biden is signaling allies are allies. He's also signaling that tolerance of autocratic regimes kind of flexing their muscles is very low in his administration, not just for Biden, but actually Jake Sullivan and Tony, who's I guess his administration working around these kind of foreign policy issues. They all have very similar approaches, which I think is relevant. So they're not divided on these issues. And then the final thing I'd say, and it's relevant particularly since this is the British American discussion, is that we are also seeing is Biden flexing his Irish heritage. Now you can hear I have an Irish accent, but you really see it actually in the engagement when it comes to the UK-US trade agreement. And often when I speak with BAB, one of the questions is, are we going to get a UK-US trade deal? And I think particularly what's very clear. So first of all, I'm not a believer in that deal kind of coming to pass anytime soon. Maybe once Biden is really struggling domestically, maybe he'll turn his attention to it a little bit. But I think one of the key factors for businesses then, weirdly, in the UK and Europe, is actually bearing in mind that the UK now has to tread carefully when it comes to Brexit and crucially the Northern Irish Protocol, because Biden has said, kind of point blank, won't consider a US-UK trade agreement if the UK reneges on the Northern Irish Protocol. And that's really quite powerful. And that's really mixing these foreign policy issues in with this big trade policy kind of point, particularly for the UK government. It would be a huge coup to get a UK-US trade deal. I think that's been one of the most interesting things. It's really seeing not just Biden's personal signaling, but also his wider signaling around what the US is and is not standing for.
So let me just make sure I heard you correctly there, Stephanie, to put a fine point on that. It sounds like you don't see a US-UK trade deal actually happening this year, but that the dynamic that Biden is using in terms of how he's interacting with the UK and Europe more broadly is one to watch.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely don't see it this year. And potentially, as I said, potentially post midterms, it comes more into focus. But even then, I have to say I'm more on the skeptical side for the outlook for a UK-US trade agreement in the kind of near term. But I think the point that Biden has been clear to make is that his cooperation and relationship with the UK is somewhat dependent on the UK's relationship with Europe. And I think that is quite interesting in the context of Brexit and the ongoing negotiations there as well, which obviously businesses are very focused on because that has implications for the corporate outlook as well.
Kate, obviously on the international side, in terms of allies, as we talked at the beginning, the tax agreements were one of the biggest things that happened last year. But as you said, there's a lot of open question marks still to be had there. And you also mentioned that no matter what happens in terms of global agreements, you expect numerous countries to raise their rates, if not this year, very soon. How do you think that's going to change the flow of money in terms of businesses around the world?
Is that for me or for Stephanie?
Kate, I was thinking you might want to jump in here since you've been following the global tax agreements so closely. You know, you were saying that you expect tax rates, I think, to go up in multiple countries, even if the global tax deal doesn't get all the I's dotted and T's crossed as soon as we thought it might be, given what we saw last year. So how do you see that changing the dynamics?
Well, I think that, you know, what we're going to see on the multilateral agreement in tax is for sure action immediately on Pillar 2, what we call Pillar 2, which is the global minimum tax of 15%. And in fact, this morning, one of the United Arab Emirates countries have come forward and have adopted a 15% minimum corporate income tax. And they didn't have a corporate income tax before. So we've seen, you know, obviously countries like Ireland raise their rates. I mean, they're going to adopt the 15%. We have the 27 member states of the EU, you know, looking to adopt this. So all of that will happen. Now, what could happen, I guess, bringing it back into the United States is the US current tax law is not in conformity with the OECD. At least that's the common perspective. So they have sort of two issues, if you will, that they have to work on. One is the tax rate on foreign earnings under the current GILTI regime is at a 13% rate. It would need to move to 15. And I'm cutting through a lot of complexity, but that's one aspect. And then there's some ways to credit foreign taxes that right now the current law allows companies to blend all the foreign taxes from wherever they're paid around the world into like one pot. But the OECD model would have them do that on a country by country basis. So there's two things that need to be changed. So some say maybe if Build Back Better doesn't go forward, does the US sort of carve out some of these international changes and just get them done separately? So obviously companies are looking at that, they're watching this, and we'll see what happens. But you know, I think this aspect of the OECD is moving. There's Pillar 1, which has a whole host of complexity. And again, I think more comments on that will be necessary, but we'll see what happens in the future.
That's really interesting, Kate, in terms of expecting action somehow, some way on Pillar 2, and that we're already seeing it, but also that if BBB doesn't move forward, that you are anticipating there could be some carve outs on the tax side, if I understood you correctly.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting. I want to leave enough time for questions. So if you do have one, anyone in the audience, you know, feel free to add it to the chat or raise your hand via the handy dandy Zoom technical application. But Kate, there was one thing you mentioned at the top of the call, and it's certainly something here at Bloomberg News we have been covering throughout this year and last year, is the supply chain issue. And you mentioned that as one of the big mega trends for this year. Where do you see the supply chain issue going this year? Do you see it getting better? Kate, I'm not sure if you heard that one. I was thinking, since you mentioned supply chains at the top, where do you see supply chains going this year? Do you think that's getting better?
Yeah, I think companies are really grappling with changing tax laws for supply chain. And so many countries now are trying to encourage companies to bring back their manufacturing or warehousing so that it's closer to the consumer, because some key things during the pandemic weren't available. And so whether that's drugs or medical supplies, certainly have seen countries take a look at that and get somewhat nationalistic in their tax laws to incent behavior to bring it back. So again, we're having a lot of multinationals are looking at that and saying maybe they need to multi-hub as opposed to single hub. And then the second big dynamic, and it was mentioned by both Doug and Stephanie a little, is sustainability. I think that is a huge business issue, and 80% of green gas emissions are emitted through the supply chain. So a lot of companies, on top of dealing with sort of new tax laws encouraging them to change where they're manufacturing, they're also looking at how can they decarbonize the supply chain. And so this is a labyrinth that companies are really grappling with, and how to set this up. Certainly business has to make the decisions, but there are tax consequences. And so, that will follow, based on that. So I do think these are big decisions. You can't move your supply chain in a flash. I mean, there's a lot to this. So companies are being very, very considered and just trying to figure this out, because a lot of business thinking for, the last 30 years, just-in-time manufacturing has really been challenged during this time that we've lived in.
Stephanie, I know you've thought about the decarbonization push as well quite a bit. How big of an issue do you think this is becoming in terms of how businesses adapt to it or plan for the future?
Oh, I think absolutely central in many ways. It's interesting because so I work with our ESG colleagues internally, and in particular, it's seen different regions. It's like the shoe dropping in different regions as you go. So like Europeans, and particularly the Scandies, were kind of the first to move, and not just in terms of, I mean, it's not just like this is a fad and you have to kind of do it for a little while. It's actually like increasingly a source of regulatory pressure, particularly in Europe. So for those in European companies here, they'll be aware of that. And I think that's only going to continue. And obviously I view this from the investment perspective, the pressure on investors to understand not only as a company what, where your emissions are coming from, but also when you invest, do you understand what you're investing in? That's only growing in the UK and Europe. And in the US, you're seeing it start, that the kind of the match has been lit, and you're really starting to see that kind of flare up. So I think that's going to be a key one to watch. And also just on the supply chain issue, I think there's also a really interesting dynamic coming through around the politicization of inflation, and it's happening across developed countries, but particularly I would say the UK and the US are two really strong examples of that, where politicians are being kind of asked to find solutions for inflation. And usually politicians aren't the ones who are solving inflation because it's a central banking issue, but there's a sense that politicians are under pressure to show that they're doing something about inflation. I think that's a really important one, because I think it will also drive the outlook for Build Back Better. Because if there is going to be a new bill, it's likely going to have to exclude some of the things that Manchin wanted excluded, which is around things potentially sick leave and child tax credits, but also include some of the things that he's concerned about. And he said number one, his big concern is inflation. So the question is, how does the Biden administration find solutions in like a government perspective? Fiscal, it's a harder place to start, but you could think about ways to alleviate the cost of inflation for poor households and how that would work. So I think those are going to be key things for the Biden administration, potentially then being able to set up a Build Back Better bill. And I don't think it's any coincidence. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not a coincidence that the State of the Union is so late. So it being in March, I think is actually likely basically proposed to give the Biden administration an opportunity to try and build something around that date. So I think that is, as Kate said earlier, March is an absolutely crucial deadline.
Yes, and certainly something we've been reporting on a lot in terms of the inflation figures. I think the last print was 7%, which is a number that we really haven't seen in a generation in the US, or certainly decades. So that is one to watch. Doug, how important do you think the inflation issue is going to be when it comes to this election season going into the midterms?
Single most important issue, period. Affects everybody, every day. In the first place you want to look is gas prices. I've got a chart which tracked George Bush. The second is job approval to gas prices. So I think inflation, people feel across the board. They feel it. I can't tell you the number of times per day I get sticker shock. And, for people who and we've had, nice 5% growth or whatever, income growth, whatever it is, well, that's terrific, except if you have 7% inflation, it means you're losing ground. It's one of the problems that, you're right, was said earlier. I mean, the government, even the Fed, I mean, the ability to control inflation is limited. And the amount of time that, first of all, to get inflation to bottom out, and secondly, to start going down, and thirdly, for people to feel the difference is a lot longer time than there is between now and election day.
Right.
And so, and, I'm older than most people on this call, but I, can remember to this day, and it was like an iron on me. I remember the gas lines in the 70s, and I remember the inflation of the 70s and the 80s. And half the country in America now, these people weren't even born then. But it has a searing psychological impact on you when you don't either know what things are going to cost, or the only thing you know for sure is it's going to cost a lot more. And I think that's going to really affect the psychology of the voters.
Yeah, it's interesting, Doug, because I was actually in the grocery store just in the past week, and there was a conversation going on between the cashier and the woman in front of me, all about food prices. And of course, like, my reporter ears were just like, very interested in what they were saying, but it was just a regular part of what was on their mind on a Saturday afternoon. So when it comes to what you were saying about what are people thinking about in their day-to-day, certainly food, gas prices, and as we know, that often hits the people in the lowest stratosphere of income the hardest, in terms of if you're living paycheck to paycheck. Those key items going up in price could further exacerbate some of the issues that, Kate, you mentioned as one of the three big trends at the top in terms of inequity, economic inequity, social inequity, which will also be a big part of the election season this year, no doubt. I just want to remind everyone, if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. And Tamara, if you see any that I'm missing on the Zoom, feel free to point me to it or jump in. I'll keep going here in the meantime in terms of other trends. Stephanie, when you think about the markets, because I know you obviously are keen to those as well, we've seen a lot of market volatility just in the past week in terms of people trying to price in inflation and where we go from here. Do you expect this to also play a big role over coming months in terms of market volatility being really exacerbated and then throwing off some plans or policies or where the economy goes from here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Doug is spot on, right? Inflation is the issue, and I think markets are very clearly aware of that. Now, part of it as well, though, is, an awareness that the Fed is going to move. And markets have kind of a funny relationship with the Fed, whereby they're worried that they'll hike and they're worried that they won't hike. So, you get a little bit of that, whereby they want central banks to show that they can act and they can make changes, but then when they make those changes, or they hint that they're going to make those changes, there can be a bit of a negative reaction as well, which can, it's the dance that they do. But I do think, looking forward, so it's interesting to think about the impact Omicron has had, because I think if you think about where some of those pressures are coming through, and the supply chain pressures are key to, I think, a lot of consumer goods in particular. When you look at where those pressures are coming through, part of it was reflecting lockdowns, right? We were all at home, not spending our money on services. And so instead we were buying things. And then not only because we were buying lots of things, physical things, but because, labor markets that require, that work in manufacturing weren't able to go to work because they had COVID. There's two sides of the same coin, I think. It seemed like that was really starting to alleviate just before Christmas. We were actually seeing signs that those supply chain pressures were starting to come down. But with Omicron, even though in many ways it's accelerating, hopefully, it's accelerating us towards an endemic world, what it probably does in the meantime is create a bit of supply chain pressure. Kind of it slows that supply chain easing coming off. just reflecting again the fact that you've got lots and lots of people getting this virus now. They're probably not going to be very, very sick from it, but they won't be able to go to work. They'll have to isolate, and that affects, you know, and you're seeing that in the political reaction as well. The decision, for example, to pretty much across developed markets reduce the amount of time you have to isolate for. That does reflect the science, but it also reflects a desire for people to be able to go back to their jobs and be back in the economy, because that's part of the pressure cooker that it can create. So I think we are expecting supply chains to become to start to ease in kind of the second half of the year, but part of it depends on, you know, Omicron, and in some ways part of it depends on things the US and UK can't quite control, because China is so crucial to the world's supply chains, and they're operating a very different COVID policy than the rest of, you know, developed markets, where they're moving towards this kind of like let it rip and hope for the best. And the Chinese haven't taken that approach at all, and so the, you know, companies will be relying not just on US, UK, European decision making, but crucially Chinese decision making, I think.
Right.
Go ahead, Kate.
And maybe just to build off of Stephanie's point, I think one of the other developments where the EU is really leading the charge that could have a global impact on is their proposals for a corporate border adjustment mechanism, which really is the reporting starts in 2023, and it's supposed to be fully implemented by 2025. And I think it's an interesting mechanism where, you know, these 27 member states come together, pass this, and it is going to try to equalize the world. So if the EU manufacturing is more expensive, you know, for the so-called green premium of making sure that goods are made in a very sustainable way, importers would be charged an adjustment, and so that, you know, they can't beat the European manufacturer who's actually doing it the proper way. It's a way to sort of get everybody to act. As we know, a lot of the emissions are coming from China and the United States, and so both of those countries have to act. And I thought that was a clever way of trying to get the globe to focus on the issues as we continue to navigate sustainability. But again, just wanted to raise another aspect of change that companies have to deal with.
Well, thanks for that, Kate. We do have a couple questions in the chat. I want to start with one that actually dovetails off the global issue. It's about trade. So Stephanie, you may want to jump in first here, but anyone feel free to jump in. Is the era of large trade agreements for the US over?
I think I'm going to be a classic caveat. I think unless it's strategically very important, yes, probably regional trade agreements are less popular. For the US, less of a focus. I think it just reflects, I mean, as much as Biden's signaling, his political rhetoric sounds so different to Trump. He was elected on a Build Back Better, let's bring domestic manufacturing back to the United States, which is ostensibly an anti-globalization sentiment. Now, it's not an extreme one. Clearly, where there are allies, where it makes sense for the United States, where there are advantages, I don't think that he would close it down. But I think taking Doug's point about like what's the longer term trend, you know, assuming Biden doesn't stay in, or even assuming he does, it's hard to tell a story of globalization speeding up again through those regional trade agreements, which is really how we got to kind of hyper globalization that we found, or hyper speed for globalization over the past few decades. To this point now, it's hard to see that really accelerating further. Particularly, it's hard to see the US being at the center of those kinds of trade agreements. And instead, I think it will be much more kind of strategic and individual opportunities, as opposed to that kind of multi-country approach. It's just less politically popular in the United States, and honestly in many other developed markets. The UK, European countries, they're all a little bit more cautious now about what globalization looks like, except for the UK government, who really want a UK-US trade deal always. That's to take that for granted.
Well, Doug, the political point is front and center of this second question, and thanks, Emmanuel, for these questions. If the Republicans took the House and Senate in the fall, what would the Republican priorities be, do you think?
Well, I'll answer that. I'm going to go back to Stephanie's comments in a minute. Their priorities are going to be to stop Biden and the Democrats. That's their legislative agenda, and get back the White House.
So even if they're in power, you don't think they'll move on actual policy? You think it'll be a build up towards 2024?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, on the over and under of, in the last 15 years, on the over and under of do you think X is going to get done or not get done? I've taken the under, which is to say we basically have broken government. Our government only works if there's a crisis or a deadline. One of the things I'm struck by is that Wall Street and corporations have priced in now to their thinking that it doesn't matter if government works or doesn't work, we're still making money. At some point, you gotta get to the checkout counter and you're paying a price for that. And I think we're seeing in Europe, some places now where there's an economic cost to the failures of the political system. There's no pricing right now in the US for paying a price for the fact that we have a broken government. So with a divided government or president and even have a Republican Congress, then political incentives are largely outside of a crisis to not get anything done and to position yourself based on who you're against. Just one last thing I want to say from what Stephanie was talking about on trade. So I remember I'm a Democrat. The dirty little thing about Donald Trump is a lot of his policies were popular, even if people found him personally repugnant. And I think that some people in the world were a little surprised that while Biden has a completely different style than Trump, when you dig down beneath the style and the substance, there's a lot more similarities on a lot of the policies that Biden is taking closer to Trump than I think people expected. And the reason why is the great divide in American politics today is between the workers and the people on one side and the oligarchs and the people with money and power on the other side. And so in a sense, you've got Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump standing on one side of the barricades. I wrote a thing called Which Side of the Barricades You On about 10 years ago. So they're on one side of the barricades. And on the other side of the barricades is Mitt Romney standing next to Hillary Clinton, sitting next to the Business Roundtable. And the energy is on the people's side of that fight. And that is only going to increase the anger. And I think Kate started the conversation about the gap, the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots that's been going on, as I mentioned earlier, for half a century, but have been enormously exasperated by COVID.
So building on that, and feel free to jump in, Kate or Stephanie, but Doug, building on your comments here, we have another question. Does it matter for business if we have a broken government, not only in the US, but you see what's going on right now in the UK in terms of issues there with Boris Johnson? Does it matter for business, or do you think, like you said, markets are just pricing in that nothing's going to get done and they can still make money? Or just going back to the top line question here, does it matter for business if we have broken governments?
Well, I can't imagine that it can't matter at some point. And I think I have to be careful here since talking about what's going on in England. I don't know that business should care that much about what Boris Johnson's party habits are and what his drinking habits are or whatever. I think they kind of do. It kind of does matter to them, like what they did about Brexit. And so I just can't imagine that it's a freebie for business or for people who, just civilians. I can't imagine that it's a freebie that you have broken government and at some point you don't pay a price for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can jump in, I think there's a tendency to assume, markets tend to assume, like, basically if the government's not getting in our way, then, that's the ideal, right? Minimal regulation. But I think actually governments have a really important role to play in terms of stabilizing and creating competition. Now, they don't tend to be that good at actually doing it when they try to kind of enforce kind of antitrust. It doesn't tend to work super well, again reflecting actually some of the ways in which systems can just be very broken, and so your ability to enact change even where you have support can be limited. And I think if you think about when do you need government, so in some ways COVID has reassured businesses that governments will act when they need to, right? Like that was kind of the message, and as Doug said, in crisis they can act, and for business I think they feel that's enough. That's kind of all they want. And the rest of the time, if they can avoid enacting extra taxes on them and, avoid increasing regulation, then that's net probably fine. But I think Doug's point is fair, which is it's not a, I think the longer you have systems and governments that are basically completely locked. And so, for example, you know, if something comes up in 2023 and you have a split Congress, but it's not so much of a crisis as COVID, then you could actually see some real inefficiencies. And I think that's what happens. Inefficiencies creep in and creep in and creep in, and they don't look as visible, but they just are, you know, companies just have to kind of gradually deal with them and build them in. And that tax code has not been reformed. And, you know, there's this kind of compromise legislation that's come in that's actually not optimal for any company, but it kind of kept both political sides happy. Those are the kinds of ways in which I think there can be a grinding effect as well of government inefficiency that can lead to company problems, or not problems, but challenges and inefficiencies, which ideally you wouldn't have in an optimal economic system.
And Peggy, I would just add to the comments that have been made that there are some multinationals out there, to Doug's point earlier, that are actually happy that the Trump policies continue. I mean, it's a relatively low tax rate environment for businesses, and you know, it's certain, and if there's small tweaks, they can take those, but they just as soon have that versus you know, what was contemplated in BBB. Now there's others, obviously every time you have a tax law change, there's winners and losers. And so, you know, there's a contingency that wants some of the credits and incentives, particularly on the environmental side, to come through on BBB. But I would just say, you know, there's such a mixed reaction in terms of multinationals, and some have said maybe the tax law that exists is better than what could come. And so, you know, just having the broken government is not a bad thing.
If I could just
jump in, Doug.
just briefly say, in terms of the the risk for corporations, I think not only, to me at least, broken government is a risk. The more you have skin in the game, the more broken stuff is bad for you. But there is another element I think that's going to is going to be a much higher risk level for corporations going forward in the U.S. And it is about what I described earlier about the political incentives of both parties following the election to get more and more extreme. And I've been in politics a long time. I never dreamed that we saw during the Trump years that corporations were not only voluntarily weighing in on political issues, publicly traded corporations were weighing in on political issues. And never in my life did I ever see a corporation volunteer to do that. Mm-hmm. And they did it because they had to do that. And we're in a 50-50 world right now in the US. So when you say X, you're offending 50% of the country, that's Y. But your silence, if you're silent now when issues come up, you're perceived by one side of the 50-50 to be taking a position. So this is an enormously dangerous environment. It's going to get much more dangerous after the election. And there's no one size fits all on how you manage this. But you got to start by looking at your stakeholders. And there are a lot of companies that we work with. Maria Figueroa, who's part of Euro's organization, is a partner at Brunswick. You first got to look at your stakeholders, and you've got a dichotomy for a lot of businesses where you've got young people, particularly if you have an educated workforce, who are not going to sit there for silence on the one hand, and you've got, I would say, depending on the situation, generally over half the country is not looking for a corporation to weigh in. So how do you manage these different stakeholders in what I think is going to be an increasingly dangerous environment for corporations is going to be, I think, the challenge in the next 2 years, which are far greater than the challenge of last year and this year. And by the way, the challenges of this year and last year are far more difficult than 4 years of Trump.
I think we only have 10. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
can I just to add to Doug's point there, I think what happened when we saw the Capitol Hill riots, whatever you want to call them, that I think is a really important potential turning point in terms of the assumption that businesses can make that US politics will be transparent, predictable, and whoever wins, whoever, the numbers say wins the election. That whole idea and the increasing kind of contestability of those results, I think can actually be a real challenge for companies, because it's that transparency and certainty that businesses benefit from in developed markets compared to, say, in emerging markets, which are more unstable and unpredictable. So if you've got a situation where the United States is now an unstable, unpredictable democracy in which, every time that there's a major election, you have this huge backlash and potential civil unrest, I don't see how that can be a positive environment for business to operate in, even if, the tax rates remain relatively low. And I strongly agree with Kate's point earlier that there are always winners and losers from any policy decision or failure to make one. There are always winners and losers.
So Kate, this last question I think we have time for is actually directed at you. And it's about another big challenge. Certainly we're watching this in the US, particularly in our newsroom, but it's focused on Europe. Are there tax policies that could alleviate the energy crisis that the UK and EU may be facing? How can companies prepare for new emergency tax legislation around high costs when it comes to gas and energy?
Right. And, honestly, I think the tax code could be used to solve some of this. I mean, this goes back to, I think, a lot of energy was not manufactured during the last few years. And so now there's a shortage at the pump. And, we can all talk about how that happened, why that happened. And so, again, I think tax legislation can be used to incent behavior or to disincent. And so right now, I think we've got to get more supply. I mean, so much of this comes down to supply and demand, and how can the codes in these areas be used to foster more manufacturing so that the price comes down. And so I think companies just have to stay abreast. I mean, there are so many tax laws changing right now. I think the biggest issue on global heads of taxes minds is how do they stay on top of all these emerging issues? And so they need to make sure that they have good help on doing that, because you can miss something in a nano because it's changing that fast. So more to come on that. It's a big issue.
Great. Well, I think maybe just to wrap things up, we can do a quick speed round between the three of you in terms of, and I'll give you a second to think about it, but what do you think is going to be the most important thing you're watching for this year of the Biden administration? So in terms of one issue you're really watching more than any other this year in the Biden administration.
I would say inflation in the economy.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, for me, it's inflation and the tax policies, whether or not they carve out these international provisions or whether something more substantial goes forward.
I think for me, it's like, can they do a version of Build Back Better that's not as big, that's a little bit more targeted, maybe tries to tackle some of the inflation stuff, but ultimately gets done because this is their last chance to do anything.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Kate Barton, to Stephanie Kelly, and to Doug Sosnick for a terrific panel that really covered the landscape, not only of what Biden was able to do with his administration in the first year, but really what to watch for this year in terms of how much they can get done on both the domestic and international scale. So thank you so much for your time, and to all of you for joining and listening and for your great questions. And I'll turn it back over to Tamara.
Thank you, Peggy. Just a huge thanks to you as well for expertly taking us through. And we covered a lot of different territory, but it was all super interesting and relevant to all of our members. So thank you from us at BAB, and to all of you. Please join us for our next session. We're convening a group of chief people officers to talk about purpose. So to a little bit of what Doug and Stephanie touched on. So join us for that. Until then, thanks everyone.